My name is Emily Ensminger. I am the program curator at Elsewhere Museum. There are very few artists who are able to experience our residency in their regular life. So for me, it's for them to have an exceptional experience that they cannot get anywhere else. I do think that I'm starting to understand that everyone's process is really, really different. I'm starting to understand that, comfort doesn't always benefit somebody, to make sure that they are comfortable and they feel supported, but they're still being challenged, and that we're not just producing work for them. Mm-hmm. Those things matter to me. Yeah, I think that Elsewhere can be a really challenging space, and it's more and more challenging the more you try to resist it. If you learn how to work with it and accept problems or problem solving, you'll have a different kind of experience than if you try to resist.
It's cool thinking of this place as like a world, or like an ecosystem. Like we only have the resources we have, and you have to use them wisely. And I mean, it's difficult coming up with a project. You can't always do something original. You can't even worry about it, but you can. The context is always new. You're always working in a specific context. I'm attracted to things that other people consider trash, but I think mostly, kind of aesthetically, like I'm just sort of addicted to like foraging, like hunting for things, right? Mm-hmm. There's something about the process of finding your materials or actually letting them, I actually kind of believe that they find you, that makes the whole sort of artistic process special and magical, and I can't help but keep them around. So it's kind of interesting being here at Elsewhere because I'm like kind of right at home, but it's also like someone else's stuff, so I feel kind of like weird. I mean, the space issue has been really kind of weird and crazy here because there's like so much space, but there's been so much stuff, and it really has felt like the energy is like kind of weird and trapped, and everything's like piling up everywhere, and there's dust everywhere, and it's a little overwhelming, but like kind of an adventure at the same time. But it's great to have time, and where you can just focus on your work. I mean, it's different from other residencies where you really just get like an empty room and you're just supposed to do your work, right? I mean, there's a lot of interesting demands of this space. And we had to come up with concepts really quickly, which was pretty overwhelming. And of course, also just George is so close to the space, which is awesome and makes it very special, and also just makes it tricky because you're like, well, can I do this thing? Like, can I use this material? You want to be respectful and also still create like your, do what you do. It's weird. It's weird having to kind of clean as you go also, like you're like, oh, I want to work in this area. Oh my God, it's covered in dust. Or there's baby dolls everywhere, or there's broken glass, and you have to find a place to put it. Like you're not, you're building on past people's projects, and everything here is important. And I really like that conceptually. I like this idea of the collection in a living space, like the objects in the space are living and breathing.
The idea, I think, was that we wanted this space that was totally outside the realms of familiarity, and yet was connected to so many things that were familiar. Myself and Stephanie came down to Greensboro, actually for a concert. So the next morning, I was like, you gotta check out my grandmother's old store. It's been locked up for 6 years and no one knows what to do with it. What if we were to come down here and move into the store and decide that nothing would be for sale and nothing would leave, and instead treat it like this massive puzzle or this sort of singular set, this archive. That was kind of our goal. That was kind of our idea, is to let this space speak through a process of continued arrangements and rearrangements. To assume that the page already is filled with words, it's just a matter of putting them in order. The history is embedded in this place. It is an archive and a time capsule of 60 years of this town and also 60 years of like America. And rather than like sell this stuff or get rid of it or put it away or turn it into a stale museum, we're actually going to invite some of the most creative, critical, engaged minds of our generation to come in and use these things to make works that become publicly available and interactive and engaged, and at the same time rethink what the museum can be in the 21st century. You know, and that still continues today, right? Like every artist that's reinstalling another artist's work or is transforming the rooms, they're like constantly responding to all these other conditions. They're having to work with all these other materials. Like there's no like clear it out, move it, put it in a box, push it away.
And elsewhere, I am filling this room with mirrors. And then I'm going to put in a 4-channel surround sound music piece, and then I'm going to fill it with LEDs from the top. So hopefully then the LEDs will reflect. But aesthetically, the place looks great where it is right now. Because the thought of moving all the mirrors was painful. But I think the thought of working in here was painful because there's just so much dangerous glass everywhere. But I'm doing it.
You were drawn to the shiniest, most dangerous room.
For sure. Yeah, when I walked in for the first time, I was just blown away. I thought it was so beautiful. I had no idea of how big this place would be. Kept being met by different people, just going, hey, welcome, it's great to have you. And they were cooking up some delicious food. So like straight away, there's a great sense of community and enthusiasm.
My grandmother Sylvia and her husband Joe ran a store in downtown Greensboro from 1939 till 1997. They moved from the furniture to Army surplus, and then my grandfather passed suddenly of a heart attack. The Army surplus business sort of came to an end. Eventually, over time, she began getting into just general thrift. Just more and more things were being accumulated.
As a kid, like, what was it like? Like, what did it feel like exploring the space when you were...
You know, for me, it was like an adventure. So I'd come here and I'd help, like, sell things, and then I'd, like, scurry in the back and just dig through boxes for hours and hours. But it always felt like a place where I was much more interested in finding things and toys and playing with them and then hiding them again so I could find them again. It was like that, you know, that box you might have in your grandmother's house that's like the box of toys.
Yeah.
It was an entire building full of that. But it was also like this place you would just sort of creep through, and like, you know, as soon as you pulled one thing out, there would be a million other things that you just start pulling out, right? So what we have now in this very orderly fashion where you can walk around and move and I'm like really comfortable in a way, there it was like you couldn't even sit down. How did I end up at Elsewhere? Hi, my name is George Shear. I'm co-founder and director of Elsewhere, a living museum and artist residency set inside of a former thrift store downtown Greensboro. Myself and Stephanie came down to Greensboro actually for a concert. So the next morning, I was like, you gotta check out my grandmother's old store. It's been locked up for 6 years and no one knows what to do with it. So what if we were to come down here and move into the store and decide that nothing would be for sale and nothing would leave, and instead treat it like this massive puzzle or this sort of singular set, this archive. The idea of a collection comes from the idea that this is a museum, or that it's a store where nothing's for sale that became a museum. And we sort of created this idea of a museum in part.
This is the postmodern museum.
It is certainly a reflection and a deconstruction of the concept of a museum. First off, that museums frame works on white walls, but also just in a very practical way, like people like don't know what to do with themselves. A museum helps guide them, but it also brings in the notion of living. Artists used to live in the Louvre at a point.
And it wasn't until I got nominated for Southern Constellations that I took a moment to really look about the place. And I also don't feel like the stuff I read online prepared me for the experience anyway, because you read about it as this living museum, and my first impression was, oh, I can just delve in and use the materials as I see fit, and then you come here and you realize that there's an order to the madness. It was overwhelming when I first walked in. Also, my flight had been delayed a couple of times, so I was several hours late. Coming to Elsewhere and seeing the collection and all of that, I immediately gravitated towards the kitchen area. Guess Who's Coming to Dinner is the title of the piece. Yeah, I'm very comfortable with other artists coming in and building upon it. I feel like, in keeping with the concept of it, I'm opening it up to be destroyed and reassembled into something new. I imagine you coming in and seeing this armoire that is stacked to the brim with all these dishes that are just shaking and shaking, with the rumbling of audio that, because the speaker has been deconstructed and is facing in on the armoire, it's muffled. It's like this muffled conversation that's going on that is shaking all the dishes. And I want you to get this sense of the building anticipation of the arrival of somebody. And as I'm using them, I'm thinking, okay, embedded in this object is a particular time period, a certain set of associations and meanings that I may have, but also those who've grown up in the South may have an even stronger or different set of associations and meanings. But understanding that it feels like layering time on top of itself. So even within that armoire and all those dishes, that's a collection of dishes from different time periods. So I think of all the various meals that have happened on those dishes. Because you have to allow a certain self to die in order for a new self to be born.
You know, living in these big cities, it's hard to feel like you actually can affect the environment.
Yeah.
Like why does it even care about you? What are you doing for it? But it's really nice that you can, like, you know, help improve this place and grow this place and become part of it, and the influence is long lasting, you know.
When I was a kid, my dad worked at Burlington. It was a textile factory, which moved overseas. And my mom worked at Converse, where they made the shoes, which moved overseas as well. I have essentially right now like 3 ways that I make work, right? So I make paintings, I do wheat paste installation, and I make found object sculptures. So when I first started like making artwork, right, it was all about race. So you realize that like race is a huge issue that doesn't get talked about enough. However, like class is like a really big deal. You have these high profile shootings that happen in the span of 3 or 4 days, right?
Yeah.
I get a call from George Shear, the founder of Elsewhere, who was seeing some of the stuff I was posting in response to that. And he said, you know, hey, if you want to use your time here to kind of deal with these issues, Elsewhere support you. So I'm taking this room that is 10 by 10 by 4.5 feet, and it's becoming a microcosm of one of these communities that are affected by the war on drugs and mass incarceration.
And if we can change the kind of embedded cultures that do exist here, the certain conservatism that exists here, the racism that exists here, if we can address the histories that the South has around class and race, and transform people's perceptions and transform the way that people live in this world, then we can, not only can we do it in other places, it will have an immense effect on all the other places.
Yeah.
It will drive their potential. It will drive them to make the changes that they ultimately need to make as well. And at the same time, I also think that like as artists are looking for opportunities, and they're having to look more and more outside of the major centers, the structures, or the power structures, the networks, the structures of the network, to really make a difference, show differently in a way. You just have to sort of go a little further out into a frontier. So, I mean, part of our mission is to connect global artists with local neighbors, and I think that you can have that kind of impact in a place like Greensboro. You can work with lots of different groups, and you can meet a lot of different people and connect people that otherwise are not necessarily engaging with artists or have experienced an artistic life. Right? So, yes, the museum, yes, the residency program, yes, the kitchen and Queer Lab and all these like operations that we have. But the moment when like an artist that was here in 2009 or was here in like 2020, who 10 years later decides to organize a group of artists to come down and run a project here or have a conference or embed themselves and produce their next work that they've been thinking about for the last 10 years.
Yeah.
That to me, like when this really becomes this like centerpiece and home for like some of the most amazing critical creative thinkers, and this becomes a dock for them, a hub for them, right? Not a moment, not an isolated moment of a movement that happens in Paris and then disappears over time, but actually like a sustained, available space where people continue to like touch and connect through. That to me is the excitement of the next 40 years. And I was just giving a tour to this woman today. She's in her 70s, and she came into the space. Went through all 3 floors, and when she came back down and walked out onto the street, she was like, "Oh, and the world is here." Right? And it was that moment of having gone through the entire building, room by room, seeing all these different spaces, moving from a room filled with army surplus to a room filled with an artist painting on the walls and doing projects, to rooms full of fabric, to old boarding house rooms, to bedrooms, to kitchen spaces, right? All these moments that are all just like flashes as you pass through so many different spaces compressed, and so many different objects that at every moment it's like that's from the 80s, that's from the 60s, that's from the 70s, that's from the 90s. At every moment you're seeing time compressed and you're seeing everything present all at once and configured in unique ways, that by the time you walk out of the space and you step back onto the street and you like see the rain, you feel the rain, you see cars, and you look at the sidewalk and you look at restaurants and stores and so on and so forth, it suddenly becomes strange. The world becomes strange. And that's what Elsewhere needs to be doing. That's what Elsewhere does.